It's a Tuesday in 1984, somewhere around 4 in the afternoon. A kid is walking home from school with a house key on a shoelace around their neck. They already know the porch will be empty. The car won't be in the driveway for another 2 hours. They cross the lawn, let themselves in, pour a glass of something from a glass pitcher in the fridge, and stand there in the quiet of an empty house. No one asks how their day was. No one checks in. No notification buzzes on a counter. There is just the hum of the refrigerator, a shaft of late sunlight falling across the kitchen linoleum, and an entire afternoon stretched out in front of them like an empty country road. That kid was probably you. And what happened in the next 2 hours? What happened across 1,000 afternoons exactly like this one is still shaping how you live your life today, even if you have never once stopped to think about it. The world has a lot of opinions about people who grew up in that decade. Younger generations call you rigid, emotionally unavailable, stuck in the past, bad at feelings. They say you should have done the work. They say it like it's a character flaw. But psychologists are beginning to tell a very different story about what that decade did to the people who lived through it. Because the 1980s didn't just hand you a childhood, it handed you a specific operating system. One that almost no generation before or since has ever run on, and most of the things you quietly like about yourself, they were built in those empty kitchens on those long afternoons in a decade that asked very little of you and, in doing so, gave you everything. If that decade shaped you, you're in the right place. Let's start with the boredom. Picture that same kid 2 hours into a summer afternoon. Homework is done. The TV has 4 channels and none of them are showing anything good. The phone is attached to the wall and there is no one to call anyway, so they do what 80s kids always did. They go outside, they find a tennis ball and throw it against the side of the garage, over and over. At some point, they start inventing rules. If it bounces off the ledge, it's a double. If it hits the drain pipe, it's an out. Within 20 minutes, there is a fully functioning universe of a sport that exists in no book, on no screen, in no other mind on earth but theirs. That was not killing time. That was construction. Dr. Sandy Mann, a British psychologist who has spent decades studying boredom, found something counterintuitive. When the mind is not being stimulated from the outside, it is forced to stimulate itself from the inside. Boredom, in her research, turns out to be one of the greatest preconditions for creativity we know of. It is the quiet, slightly uncomfortable pressure that drives the brain to invent its own stories, its own games, its own solutions. And children of the 80s did not just experience boredom. They lived inside it for hours at a time, with no escape hatch. That is why, as an adult, you can sit with yourself. Why you don't need a podcast running while you do the dishes. Why a long drive in silence is a pleasure, not a punishment. You aren't antisocial. You aren't withdrawn. You are someone whose inner world was built by hand, brick by brick, on afternoons nobody was watching, and that inner world is something most people under 30 have never been allowed to build. Now let's talk about waiting. There was a song you loved on the radio in 1986. You couldn't download it. You couldn't stream it. The only way to own that song was to sit on your bedroom floor next to a boombox with a blank cassette loaded in for hours, waiting for the DJ to play it. And when he finally did, you had maybe half a second to hit record before the intro started. If you missed it, you waited another day, maybe another week. You didn't complain, you just waited. In the 1970s, a Stanford psychologist named Walter Mischel put a marshmallow in front of a 4-year-old and told them they could eat it now or wait 15 minutes and have 2. The kids who could wait grew up to have better grades, better jobs, better relationships. Mischel wasn't testing willpower. He was measuring what psychologists now call executive function, the ability to hold a goal in mind while the world tempts you in 1,000 directions. The 80s were one long marshmallow test. You waited for the episode. You waited for the film to develop. You waited for the payphone to ring. And every single time you waited, a small, quiet piece of circuitry in your brain got a little stronger. That is why, decades later, you can do things the modern world is rapidly losing the ability to do. You can finish a book. You can stay in a marriage through a hard year. You can work at something for a decade before it pays off. You aren't disciplined because you were born with more of it. You are disciplined because a whole decade refused to give you what you wanted the moment you wanted it, and you learned to survive the gap. And then there's the thing almost nobody talks about: the falling down. You were 8 years old. You wiped out on your bike on a hot stretch of asphalt, and when you looked down, your knee was a mess of blood and gravel. There was no adult within a quarter mile of you, no phone in your pocket, no one to post about it to. You sat on the curb for a minute. You breathed. You wiped your eyes with the bottom of your t-shirt, and then you walked your bike home, washed the cut out in the bathroom sink, put a band-aid on it, and got on with your evening. Nobody praised you for it. Nobody even knew. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent his career studying something he called self-efficacy. The deep, gut-level belief that when something goes wrong, you can handle it. It isn't built by praise. It's built by being put in situations slightly beyond your ability and figuring it out on your own. 80s kids were handed that moment every single day, and it wired something into you that cannot be bought, downloaded, or installed later in life. The quiet knowing that says, underneath all your anxiety and all your doubt, I've been here before. I'll figure it out. I always have. But here is where we have to slow down. Because the same decade that built these gifts also built some costs. And if we don't name them honestly, the validation becomes a lie. You were rarely asked how you felt. You were expected to be fine. Tears were a thing to hide. Asking for help was weakness. Many of you grew up with the unspoken rule that emotional needs were an inconvenience, and you learned very early to handle everything on the inside and show almost nothing on the outside. Psychologists now have a word for the long-term version of that pattern. They call it emotional suppression. And while it can look a lot like strength, it can quietly raise your risk of depression, of anxiety, and of disconnection in the relationships that matter most to you. So before you wear the 80s like a badge, it is worth asking, honestly, which of these traits in me is strength and which is armor? Because self-reliance and avoidance can look almost identical from the outside. The difference is whether you can let someone in when it matters or whether you still, decades later, handle everything alone because you don't actually know how not to. That is the cost the decade charged. And naming it is the only way to keep the gifts clean. If you've done that honest look and you know the difference, then keep what the 80s gave you, because what it gave you is rare now. You are one of the last people alive who was raised without a screen in your hand. You learned to be alone before loneliness became a public health crisis. You learned to wait before the world forgot that waiting was a skill. You aren't out of step with the modern world because something is wrong with you. You're out of step because the modern world has quietly lost a lot of what you were given for free. A decade that handed you less, gave you more than any algorithm ever could. Your quiet, your patience, your strange, stubborn competence. These aren't leftovers from an old life. They are the deepest, steadiest parts of who you are. Tell me down in the comments. What's one small, specific memory from the 80s that you think quietly shaped the adult you turned into? A sound, a smell, a Saturday afternoon, something small. Let's see how many of us are still carrying the same things. And if this one landed, the video on your screen right now goes deeper into the generation that grew up on the exact edge of the digital age, what they kept and what they quietly lost.